Yes, welcome to the after show on Telecom TV. I'm Guy Daniels, Director of Content, and we are broadcasting live at the end of day 2 of the Telecom TV Summit on Open RAN. And once again, we've got a great lineup of guests joining us today, and we are going to answer as many of your questions as we possibly can. So if you haven't yet got in touch, and many of you have, then please do so now. The sooner the better. Don't leave it too late, whatever you do. Use the form on the Telecom TV website below this video. And co-hosting the after show is, as usual, my colleague Ray Lemaitre, Editorial Director here at Telecom TV. Hi, Ray. Now, earlier today, we explored the issues around systems integration and the development of the Open RAN ecosystem and community, because we're now really getting down to the nitty-gritty of figuring out how to deploy and operate this technology.
Yeah, indeed, Guy. And the systems integration topic was also a real hot potato on yesterday's live Q&A show as well. Everybody wants to know which companies are best placed to stick these multi-vendor elements together and, importantly, take responsibility for the outcome. To be fair, most Open RAN topics are pretty hot right now, and I know we have a question in today's show about security too, so look forward to that one. And we won't have any dead air today, that's for sure. Plenty to talk about.
Well, there's confidence for you. That's what I like to hear. So let's get to it. And joining us live on the after show today are Pallav Paliwal, who is Chief Architect, Network Cloud Leader at IBM. Rima Yontel, Chief Architect, TME Technology, Strategy and Execution Office at Red Hat. Keith Johnson, President of Parallel Wireless. Jason Hoffman, President and CEO of Mobile Edge X. And Gil Hellman, who is Head of Global Technical Telco Sales at Wind River. Hello everyone, good to see you all again. Now we do have lots of audience questions to get through in the next 45 minutes or so. So Ray, over to you for our first question.
Thanks, Guy. And this first question is going to come to you, Pallav. And the question is, and it's specifically about IBM, what is IBM doing in terms of testing zero-touch provisioning for Open RAN for day 0 and day 1? And specifically, on which use cases is IBM focusing for Open RAN?
Well, IBM has a product, which is CP4NA, Cloud Pak for Network Automation, which takes care for all your day 0, day 1, day 2 stuff. So let's start, when you deploy a RAN site, it starts from the site planning, which is basically, talking about more cloud planning stuff, your application stuff. Then you enter into the automated designs, which is your HLD and LLD designs, more kind of automated stuff coming from IP planning and etc. Then the major part, comes when you go into the build of these clouds. You have to basically, first tell, how your servers needs to be automated. So all your configuration, coming out from BIOS settings, ILO settings, software upgrades, all these needs to be have a manual kind of touch today. So it needs to be automated, from the day 0 and day 1 stuff. Then you talk about, how the OpenShift or any of the cloud software needs to be deployed in an automated fashion manner. So this is about, how the cloud needs to be deployed. And then your orchestration of the application, onboarding of those applications on top of the cloud. So you don't have to go in such kind of complexity where you're talking about, the planning stuff, the designing stuff, then you basically how to build that stuff, and obviously covering the day 2 use cases also, which is a part of the zero-touch provisioning process. And this is where, we are normally testing, with our ORAN ecosystem partners heavily into our niche-based and Dallas Labs, we are testing, all those kind of zero-touch provisioning to make simplification of these day 0, day 1, and day 2 stuff. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Pallav. So I'm guessing that we're not going to have a lot of other takers on today's panel to answer that specific question. So in which case, I'm going to hand straight over to you, Guy, for question number 2.
Great, thanks very much, Ray. This next question's come from a viewer who's watched the ecosystem panel earlier. Rima, I think this is ideal for you. So let me start with you with this question. The question is, can the Open RAN market support hundreds of new entrants? There's lots of talk about expanding the ecosystem, but is there enough business to keep lots of new companies afloat?
Well, in my opinion, at the beginning, as we've seen before with many other new services that come into the telcos, you might see an explosion of new entrants. And it might start with hundreds of them, especially if something like app stores for X apps or R apps come to be, or catalogs. But as we go along and the ecosystem matures and 5G matures and Open RAN matures, I think we'll see the usual merger and acquisition dance around all the new entrants. And it will probably shrink to a more manageable number of companies. But the point of the Open RAN is that it is offering the opportunity for the new companies to come in and try and offer something brand new, because it's software based, right? So software companies can easily try something new, and if it doesn't work, move on to something else. So there's lots and lots of opportunities. It's just a matter of people taking advantage of it, and the customers trusting the new entrants and putting them into their networks.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Rima. This has proven to be a popular question. So let me go first of all across to Jason.
Well, I think all the operators involved in the effort would like to think that it leads to greater vendor diversity, but I don't know of a single net new vendor that has appeared in the RAN space as a consequence of Open RAN. What I see is some relatively mature and older, quote unquote startups that have gone and done that, but it's still pretty consolidated around all the typical sets of names. So I think the question as to whether someone wants to get entrepreneurial in the space and is actually capable of raising funds and then going through the typical types of selling and qualification cycles that one goes through with an operator, it's a pretty high barrier of entry from a startup perspective, to be entirely candid.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Well, it absolutely is for any startup companies looking at the telecoms, especially the telecoms infrastructure space. It's very, very difficult indeed. Keith, your views on this?
No, thank you. We're one of the companies that's trying to do that, and it's certainly true that parallel wireless reaches back before Open RAN became popular, but the principles around openness and disaggregation are really at our roots, and we see that parallel wireless and the Open RAN movement evolved largely in parallel, and so we're trying to do that, and we feel a lot of the statements that have been made. The investment required to get to a certain minimum threshold is incredible. The sales cycles are very challenging, but importantly, we're doing it, and I don't know that it's easy. In fact, I can promise you it's not easy. But it is achievable. Now, what I think about is more about the ecosystem. Parallel wireless is down a path and will be successful on that path. But can there be more players? And I think part of the premise of Open RAN is exactly to be open. What that means is that you don't have to solve the whole problem. When parallel wireless started, we had to solve the whole problem of the RAN, or we had no way to approach customers. If you look forward just a year or two, you can think about X apps. You can think about novel hardware coming to market. Right? These are all things that had no route prior to Open RAN to get to customers. And so I think that does lead to a lot of diversity. Will it look like thousands of entrants in the market? No, there'll certainly be a fewer big players. But I do think we're going to start to get diversity. Even in this panel, we're seeing disaggregation between the various layers of the software. And I don't think we should overlook that.
No, you're right, Keith. You're right about our panel makeup as well. Good point. Gil, do you think we can slice this pie so that everyone who wants a slice can actually get a slice?
Yeah, it's a very good question. First of all, if we look at 5G and how much extra capacity you'll need, many more sites, it's definitely presenting a lot more opportunities. And there is a lot of business. So it's really coming also to the service providers. How much they're willing to be working with the newcomers, for example. It's not just about a startup raising up the funds and coming up, but those cycles are very long cycles and the operators are very demanding. And one of the things that operators usually look, it's the strengths of the company and how much time they're in business. So operators also need to be a little bit more entrepreneurial and, let's say, be willing to work with the newcomers. And I think we'll see a lot more in this case. Again, there is a lot of business. There is a lot more need for capacity that definitely present the opportunity for newcomers. There was mention also on the hardware side, for example, the disaggregation, the software, it's all true. And definitely you've seen, especially on the software side, where it's a lot easier. You see some small company and newcomers being more successful in this area. Also from the application side, the X apps, for example, those type of things will present a lot of opportunity for smaller companies. And I do think we will see more comers into the market.
Excellent. Thank you for those comments, Gil, and thanks everyone for your answers to that question. In that case, I think, Ray, we shall move along and hand back to you for our next question.
Well, thanks, Guy, but I just want to continue that last question on a little bit, because the question was really about, is the Open RAN sector going to be big enough to support more companies? And I think Jason makes a good point that so far we're only seeing, names that we already know playing in the Open RAN sector. Is it possible, I want to put forward, is it possible that we might see a lot of new entrants, but they're not necessarily startups or new companies, that they might be enterprise IT companies that have never been in the telecom or communication services sector before, might come in and start to develop X apps or R apps specifically for private network Open RAN environments. So there might be new entrants that way. Not necessarily looking for a response there, but I thought I might just throw that in and pretend that I'm paying attention to what's going on in the industry.
Rimmer has a response there, Ray.
Okay, Rimmer.
I wanted to continue on the thought that you just presented. Yes, maybe the enterprise companies, maybe the new entrants. The main point is the operators have to provide the environment for those new entrants to come in easily enough, right? Right now, one of the biggest barriers is what Jason mentioned, having to deal with the operators, with the environments, with the security requirements, with their very specific types of platforms. So you often have to onboard individually on that platform. It's a one-off every time. So it's operators that create their own platforms and their own environments that make it easy to onboard new applications and new services that would make this more lively ecosystem, if you will. Otherwise, smaller companies just would not be able to survive something like that.
Yeah, no, it's always been a problem. And let's hope we see a broadening of the environment. Early days, though, early days. Right, I went off piece there. I know we need to crack on and get through more questions. So let's go on to the next question. And Keith, this one is going to come to you first. And the question is, what is preventing the RIC from being applicable to the traditional RAN? So this is the RAN intelligent controller. Where does the RIC sit in the mobile network architecture? I'm not sure. I can't remember if we stitched two different questions together. I think possibly we did. But the question is, what is preventing the RIC from being applicable to traditional RAN systems as well as Open RAN? And where does the RIC sit in the mobile network architecture? So Keith, let's come to you with that one first.
Oh, great. So why don't I take those in the opposite order and just quickly explain what the RIC is and define or explain why it hasn't yet applied to legacy RAN implementations. And so the RIC is meant to be a brain. It's meant to be something that has a broader perspective than a sector or a site or a cluster, and is making intelligent decisions around how to optimize the performance of the network. And that optimization can largely take two forms. There can be real-time optimization or near real-time optimization, or there can be non-real-time optimization. Near real-time optimization happens very, very quickly in the moment. Non-real-time involves things like data mining, complex analysis, and it can take place over the course of days or hours might be a very quick version of this. And so you're starting to see that there's two RICs, in fact. There's the near real time and the non-real time. So as you might conclude, near real time RICs need to be placed in a latency sensitive position in the network. So they're going to be closer to the edge. There may be more than one, in fact, because there needs to be some performance taken into consideration when you consider their placement. The non-real time RICs will be much more centralized and will have a much broader scope of decision making that unfolds over a longer period of time. And so that's what the RIC is, and that's where it's likely to be placed in the network. But when we think about the legacy RAN implementations, why can't these things apply? Well, there's two reasons, and a lot of it comes down to openness. The first is that the telemetry, the information about what's happening, has to make its way out of the RAN vendor and in to the intelligence of the RIC. Quite often, KPIs, other pieces of data don't propagate out of legacy vendor solutions. And so we're starving these centers of intelligence, these analytical functions, from getting the inputs they need. The second piece is then on the round trip, the control, the levers, the dials, the knobs that allow the intelligence to express value also need to be present on these implementations. And so Open RAN solves this by creating a flow of telemetry and then by enabling control. Legacy implementations tend not to. They tend to have this information buttoned up. And any of us who have worked with them have struggled to understand why we can't get into the internals and we can't get access to the control. Maybe that will change. I think there'll be pressure from the ecosystem and from the community. But as it stands today, these are two different worlds.
Okay, interesting. Anybody else want to come in on this at all? All right. Okay. Guy. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, Jason. Let's come to you on this.
Oh, no, I mean, I think it's, the core issue of this, I believe, is not that, and again, myself having worked at traditional vendors and even worked on, like the radio controller aspect of things sitting in my portfolio, it's not quite as simple as just existing vendors open up interfaces and start providing certain data feeds and that type of thing for a lot of the existing equipment. The core issue there is that a lot of those systems are designed the way they're designed because of the procurement practices of operators requiring certain indemnification around that type of equipment and sort of like what that looks like, and hitting certain price points. Whenever you sit down and start adding an optimization process, what you're saying is that, of course, that's where all machine learning and AI feeds into, is all around optimization and care. But you're talking about now collecting, potentially a tremendous amount of metadata that has to go somewhere. And it is of this purpose of, optimizing things either near real time or real time. And none of that's free. So if you decide to sit down and say, well, look, let's say hypothetically you're doing terabits per second of traffic on a network overall. Okay, well now what percentage of that is going to be additional network traffic as a result of metadata that you're collecting? Where's that metadata going to go, and exactly what type of footprint? Because you head into really large metadata requirements pretty quickly in a lot of these types of environments. And I think if you're doing that within the context of Open RAN also being something that's trying to drive down unit economics, it's a core system design issue and conversation that has to happen around the economics and the indemnification of those types of things. That's as critical as like a system integration conversation. I don't think it's as simple as just whether interfaces are open or closed to outside people or not.
Okay, thanks, Jason. And the economics, I think, is coming up in a later question and also in our poll results as well, which we'll see a bit later on. Okay, Guy, let's come back to you for the next viewer question.
Yep, thank you, Ray. And a reminder to our viewers, please keep the questions coming in, please. New questions coming in, please. That's great. Jason, it's back to you, really, because I think this question is right up your street, and it really builds on a discussion we had in yesterday's program. The question is, To what extent are telco edge platforms ready to run Open RAN deployments?
I think when you look at edge, quote unquote, which is really meant to extend and use a lot of the architectural and component elements that you see in clouds, but as an embedded application environment inside of wireless networks, one of the critical workloads that needs to run on an edge is, of course, elements of the network itself, including RAN. When you look at the requirements that sort of places, as was mentioned earlier, being able to support many underlying platforms other people have chosen, and there's even more diversity there than ever. I mean, particularly with Amazon, Microsoft, Google showing up with footprints and inside of operator networks and the like. Excuse me. And so, like for example, what we've done in Linux Foundation and Edge and GSMA and some of the other efforts around edge platforms, those currently support all underlying infrastructure choice and public cloud options today, in addition to traditional vendor options. Then you have a pretty clear technical requirement for managing heterogeneous compute and how you do hardware offload. A canonical example of this is things like PCIe based RAN offload capabilities and things like Intel's FlexRAN and the like. So the current edge environments support heterogeneous compute environments, whether it be FPGAs, GPUs, traditional mainboard CPUs. And then I think as we talked about earlier, there's a big part around instrumentation, data collection, the controller. Well, real-time, highly scalable control systems is one of the other large categories of edge applications. And so, hosting a control system on it is one of the target use cases. Those are relatively straightforward. And then I think there's everything around as we said, the optimization and, sort of testing and rollout and everything else, which means categorically putting in an AI and machine learning pipeline environment and a full CI/CD requirement. So, when we start heading into, can you run real-time control systems? Can you actually do CI/CD? Do you manage sort of AI and machine learning pipelines? Can you sort of do heterogeneous compute environments? Can you support any platform that exists within operator networks today? Those have all been base technical requirements for the edge platforms that are out there.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Gil, let's come over to you first, and then we'll go down to Rimmer.
Sure. I think the question was, is it ready? I would say the answer is absolutely yes. We see it today in commercial deployment. What Verizon did was a completely disaggregated RAN 5G deployment. They disaggregated between the application and the cloud platform, and it's happening. Now, is there an evolution? Yes. If we're looking, for example, at Open RAN, we're looking at the frontal interface, the disaggregation of this part, the ability to take, for example, a radio unit from one vendor and a DIV from another vendor. There's still work to be done there, especially on the higher frequency sides of things. But if we're looking at the edge platforms, it's absolutely ready. It's been deployed today commercially at scale, national scale. So not a tiny operator, for example, that just trialing something. There is multiple, I would say more than trials, even initial deployment beyond the one that I mentioned. So it is absolutely ready. And definitely over time, it will evolve and get even, simpler, better. But the economics is there today also. If you're looking at a deployment today of a VDU, for example, on a general purpose hardware, economically it's there.
Great. So that's a yes from Gil. They are ready. Rimmer, what do you think?
I would say the components are ready for the operators to consume. What they're struggling with, from my experience, is how to put them all together and how to integrate them with the existing legacy systems they already have in their networks, and how to train their people for these new environments, because processes and people is as crucial as actual technology. And sometimes people forget about it and it's like an afterthought, and then they realize they have to operate this and they didn't put the tools in place to be able to do that. So that's one of the biggest challenges that I'm seeing in getting the edge ready. But another thing is, which edge are we talking about? Because as you know, we have regular edge, we have far edge, we have somewhere in between. So some of them are more ready than others because they're closer to the central systems. They're looking more like traditional but smaller scale data centers, which operators have already been doing for a little while. So they already got handle on how to operate these. But the far edge, the ones that are going to be deployed in tens of thousands and have to be managed, mostly automated because you don't want to have truck rolls to remote sites. That's one that still needs to be solved, in my opinion.
Thanks, Rima. Well, let's quickly go back to Gil.
Sure. So I do want to point out the case of Verizon and Far Edge, Wind River. It's been done. There is a blueprint for success. It is in commercial in thousands of locations. So I tend to have a little bit different point of view. I do agree that all the components are there, but it's beyond the component. The blueprint is there and it's been done and done successfully, and it's in a large scale.
Great, thanks very much, everyone. And anybody else want to comment on this question? Pallav, did you want to comment as well?
Yeah, so as mentioned by Gil and Rima, I think, most of the operators, if we talk about Verizon is story, but there are, a couple of other operators which are still in a dilemma that whether we should go to the distributed computing or whether we should basically go for single node implementations. And if you see, most of the vendors, some have a specific single node cluster implementation already there. Some are, coming up with new, kind of distributed computing. So that dilemma still needs to be sorted because there are different geographies. And if you take up a couple of the examples, coming out from APAC where there are specific fiber issues, maybe single node clusters will be a successful example. But if you see, from the overall low-end perspective where these fiber issues and other things are not there, then, distributed computing, needs to be much more evolved. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And also let's bring in Keith to get a full house on this question, which is asking the question, to what extent are telco edge platforms ready to run Open RAN deployments?
Well, so I have to point out we're the Open RAN platform. And so we're the ones deploying on top of these edge computing infrastructures. And the truth is we do it. And so I think it's important to just level set and say that these things are in production, as others have said, and operators can be successful. And not just the largest operators like Verizon. It's great that Verizon can do it. Somebody at that scale has to do it first. But what about everybody else? There's a lot of countries in the world and a lot of operators, and they are being successful. They're being successful in our deployments. But I also want to point out that the RAN is incredibly varied around the world. And I think we've solved the first set of problems around how edge infrastructure can support Open RAN. But there's a lot of problems we haven't solved. The more rural sites are not well understood yet. And when we think about the day zero, day one, day two scenarios, some of those problems are solved, but many of them are not. And so it is important to acknowledge that we're making success. We do have some victories, but this is really just the start of a journey. And I think especially doing it economically, that remains a big challenge. And I don't think we should overlook that.
No, quite. Thank you, Keith. And do you want to quickly go back to Rima?
Yes, thanks. I agree with Gil. Verizon has done a lot of work. What they deployed probably is not really an Open RAN, but still, it's tremendous what they've been able to accomplish. But they've accomplished it in more traditional markets, right? It's not rural markets. It's not ones that are harder to reach. And also, the other point is Verizon is early adapter, and we all know that, right? What Verizon is able to do and the amount of money they're able to put behind it is not the same as some of the smaller tier ones or tier twos will be able to do. So yes, Verizon is a great example. They're leading the way forward, and thanks to them because they push the innovation forward. But it's something that smaller operators need to be able to to pick up as well, right? And I don't think for them it's going to be as easy because it has not been easy for Verizon, and I know that for a fact.
Well, I feel we could have a very, very long discussion on this particular question. So what we're going to have to do is move along and bookmark this, Ray, because we must pull this out and create its own panel session at the next Open RAN Summit. Plenty to talk about, I'm sure. But for now, thanks everyone for responses to that question. And let me go across to Ray for our next viewer question.
Okay, thanks, Guy. And Gil, this one is coming to you first. And this is the one I alluded to earlier. And the question is, what are the key security threats towards deploying Open RAN? And is the industry ready to overcome them? So that's a pretty big question. That's coming to you first, Gil.
It's definitely a very big hot potato. So yes, same like with the Edge platform discussion, it's always an evolution. There are, when you look at security perspective, you look at the Open RAN, you look at Far Edge, there is different elements that you need to look at, and definitely some are there today. Some, will need to evolve. I will say overall, I believe it's ready for at least the models that we're seeing out there, whether you call it an Open RAN or not, whether you basically disaggregate the front haul, the middle, and the back haul, or you just disaggregate between the application and the platform. If it's applicable to the definition of Open RAN or not, this can be a debate. I can tell you from the platform perspective, first of all, okay, what security means. It means that the platform support things like trusted root of trust, secure boot, making sure that the workloads that are running are signed and basically are not tempered, or if someone tries, you're able to block it and to report it. Many of those sites are remote sites that are not in the same level of, let's say, control and that you have in a big data center from a security perspective. So there is this extra layer of making sure that if someone try to tamper the hardware to stick, let's say, a USB and introduce a malware or something like this, the system is protected. And those level of technology exist today in the platform to support this. Then there is the acceleration of security acceleration, things like when you have your frontal and it's encrypted, and those type of things, the ability to do it in the right performance. And again, those are already there. Then there is the security aspect of, for example, the RU come from one vendor and the DU from another vendor and the CU from another vendor, and making sure that there is, when you mix and match those vendors, there is no security holes that comes through this. And I would say that this is probably one of the areas that things will need to evolve over time. To Rima's point, I think today what we see, again, it's about the definition of how we define Open RAN, but in the deployment that you see today, many times the RU, CU, and DU comes from the same line. Okay, the application and the RU itself, that it's physical, come from the same, basically, vendor chain. Okay, so they're definitely secure from the way they connect. And again, the cloud platform, the hardware platform provides you the element that you need to make sure that it's secure. So if you're looking from this perspective, I do believe it's secure and it's done today. If you're looking from the perspective of mixing and matching those elements, I think there is still a little bit more work to be done in this area.
Okay, thanks, Gil. Very comprehensive response there. Thank you. Rima, let's come to you next.
Yeah, so security is a huge topic for any telco, especially when they're deploying horizontal platforms and they want to collocate applications from different vendors on the same platform. One of the challenges that we've noticed is some of the traditional incumbent vendors are used to having their monolithic solutions where they control the whole stack from the hardware all the way to the application and services layers. And that's how they develop the applications. So they don't necessarily utilize the modern security principles. And when you try to deploy these applications on a horizontal platform alongside other vendors' applications, we often see that there's a conflict. Simplest example is requiring like admin access to the platform. And that's like changing the actual thinking, how you develop, how you deploy, how you operate the application and the service, still needs to mature, in my opinion. Otherwise, the level of isolation and level of security that you want to be able to expand your ecosystem, right? To be able to allow those hundreds of potential newcomers, that's never going to materialize if that's not solved.
Okay, yep, definitely lots of new processes to be learned. Okay, I think if we don't have any further responses to that question, Guy, I'm going to hand back over to you. Oh, I'm sorry.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I think Gil just wanted a quick comeback there, yeah?
Yes, sure.
Sorry, Gil.
I do want, no problem. I do want to add to what Rima says. I do agree. It's evolution. We do see, was mentioned, many vendor wants to run, for example, admin or privilege mode, which by definition, it's not even how you do cloud native. It's not. And we do work within the Open RAN Alliance, the ORAN Alliance, and other areas. For example, WindRiver and Reddit together, we made a contribution around the whole time synchronization notification to basically allow a video application to get the right state of the time synchronization without needing to run in a privilege mode. And it's a great example because prior to this, basically coming from the old mindset, the video vendors basically were just like, okay, I will reach in a privilege mode and grab this information. And this is definitely present multiple issues. Security, it's one of them. Not being cloud native, it's another one. So there is definitely a lot of work done in the community to standardize this, to make those things a lot more streamlined, to work with the different ecosystem vendor to educate them and together to make those changes.
Okay, thanks, Gil. Okay, Guy, then time is running on. Over to you for the next part of the show.
Yep, thank you, Ray. We should have a look at our audience poll for this year's Open RAN Summit. One question this week, 5 multiple choice answers. It's right here on the website. It's quick and easy to complete, and we have already received the most responses for any of our summit polls. So thank you to those who have already voted. And the question we are asking this week is, which of these is the most important area of focus for the Open RAN community during the next 12 months? And you can see the up to the second, not even up to the minute, up to the second real-time data coming in here. Wow, I can see a surge in support for the RIC option. That certainly wasn't there at this time yesterday, although the total cost of ownership is still out in front, but security lagging behind in 5th place. So do you agree or disagree? Have your say, vote today. We're keeping the polls open all week and we'll take a final look in tomorrow's after show program. Okay, back to the Q&A. We are about coming up to 40 minutes into the show now, so we've still got time for a few more questions. Ray, have you got our next one?
Yep, thanks, Guy. And just interesting to note there that, no runaway leader in that poll result, but the overall total cost of ownership has been ahead since the start of that poll. So that's a pretty good indicator to where people are really thinking. Follow the money, they always say, don't they? So the next audience question we've got, and we're putting this out to the whole panel here today. And this question is, how important is hardware acceleration for DU software performance and capacity? So this is the distributed unit. So hardware acceleration, how important is that for Open RAN systems in the DU? Does anybody want to pick up this question at all? Okay, Gil, we'll come to you first and then Keith.
Sure, and thank you. It's absolutely critical, especially as you go to the higher spectrum, to the 100 megahertz C-band. Coming back to the poll, the TCO, it has a direct influence and implication on the TCO. You can possibly not even do it just in software, and even if you're able to do it in software, the cost will just be cost prohibiting. So it will break the whole equation of making it financially viable. So the hardware accelerator and the ability to support it and support placing the workload in the right way where the hardware accelerator is located, it's very critical.
Okay, thanks, Gil. And Keith?
Yeah, broadly speaking, I agree. I think that the hardware acceleration is going to end up being a very important part of the picture. As parallel wireless went through 2, 3, and 4G, it wasn't central in terms of getting the basic functionality that's needed. Certainly for 5G, for higher bandwidth, higher spectrums, we're going to need that, and I think that's a generally accepted sort of position in industry. But I really think it goes to the TCO. And a lot of these things are very specialized. And if you want to drive down the TCO, you're going to have to identify the most consumptive parts of your system. And you're going to have to create some sort of accelerated version of that. Maybe it's your own silicon as an extension card, or maybe it's leveraging some accelerator that's already built into the platform. But I don't see a world reaching out even 2 or 3 years where accelerators aren't just an assumed part of the DU ecosystem.
Yeah. Okay, great. And that does make an awful lot of sense. Okay, thanks very much, Keith. Guy, we'll come to you. We are cracking through these questions. This is great. The more the merrier. Let's come to you for the next one.
Yeah, we certainly are. And the next question from our audience, this is a very interesting one. The question is, and it's open to all of you, of course, is ecosystem governance up to the challenge of Open RAN? Most approaches today are membership fee based and led by large corporates. So do you think there is a need for new governance mechanisms, such as using blockchain to build trust among the ecosystem stakeholders to make decisions? Interesting question coming off the back of the ecosystem panel there. Any of our guests today want to tackle this one? Keith, that's great. Yeah. Thanks very much, Keith. Over to you.
Yeah, well, somebody's got to go first. So as an ecosystem evolves, it's okay. As an ecosystem evolves, then there's going to be challenges. We have to learn what needs to be governed, and really that's how I'd start this. There's a lot of things that could be governed. We had security as a topic that came up. That's one area where governance might be needed. What was incredibly encouraging there is that we saw different partners working together. Players that might be competitive in some contexts working together in order to find new and interesting solutions. I think it comes down to deciding what's going to be governed and who's going to do the governance. And I would argue that the next best place is going to be the system integrators. The people responsible for pulling together the solution are going to bear some burden for certifying that the solution works together and that all the component pieces that exist do roll up into something which is sensible, secure, practical, scalable. All concerns need to be covered at that final point. Is blockchain an interesting way to get better leverage out of a zero trust philosophy across the distributed ecosystem? Perhaps. I feel like that's a little bit of a hammer looking for a nail. And I think probably we should start with something that's a little more basic and identify the key accountable parties, and then lean on practices that we've seen in open source and other industries. And then I'd build from there.
Great. Thanks very much for that, Keith. Interesting comments there about coming back to the systems integrators. Anybody else, any of our other guests want to have a few words about this question? If not, then Jason, please.
No, I was just saying I don't think it's a technical issue to go and solve. I mean, the sort of ecosystem governance issue comes down to whether the bodies in this space are going to be recognized as a true independent standards body, and then whether they can resolve some of the political issues. Yeah, I mean, like for example, just the commingling of U.S., European, and Chinese vendors and operators. But I think it's heading into basically the political issues, the typical things around, antitrust and that type of thing. But it's all about just whether it's going to evolve into a true independent sort of standards effort or not. But it's not technical.
Indeed. No, absolutely. Thanks, Jason. And Pallav.
Yeah. So as mentioned by Keith, I'm just picking up from there that the system integrations needs to be play a very important role, because if you can see a lot of new and interesting, partnerships are coming into the ORAN ecosystem. A lot of NAPs basically, a lot of then upcoming, equipments into ORAN vendors. They are, tying up more and more with the SIE partners and also with the software providers, so that they can, really encash those opportunities of automating the entire piece of the Orange journey. Second thing is about the new upcoming RU vendors. So how the system integrators play important role, and the upcoming Orange vendors, how these tie-ups needs to be done. You must have seen an important announcement like Mavenir, SCL, and others. So we need to see how it's much more evolved actually in the coming days. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pallav. Ray, I think we might just have time to squeeze in a follow-up question.
Yeah, and I think this is related, and this is one that came in just before the start of the show, and I think it does relate to this issue of governance. And the question, it came as more of a statement, but somebody's gone and taken a look at the ORAN Alliance and which companies have been making contributions. And the conclusion that this person has drawn is that most of the input into the specifications work of the ORAN Alliance is coming from the big traditional companies, the companies that have a lot of people, a lot of money, a lot of resources. So I think the question was, can there really be a lot of innovation in Open RAN if specifications and the industry bodies driving Open RAN are really being driven by the efforts of the large traditional, and mainly vendors there as well. So, is this a governance issue? Is there a way that more companies can get involved in steering the direction of where specifications and blueprints, etc., go? Is this even a problem? Any takers? Yeah, Keith. Thanks, Keith.
Yeah. Like I said, I'm always happy to jump in the pool first. So it's true, right? What's being described is true. What we see is that it's the larger organizations that have lots of resources are investing those resources to help develop these standards, and so they influence more than the smaller players or the newer entrants into the space, be they startups or more established companies that are entering the space. That's a little bit frustrating for us, but I think it's okay, because what it means is that using parallel wireless as an example, we are driven to innovate in other areas. And so what you're going to find is that the standards bodies will evolve, but all the places that aren't governed by standards is where you're going to see disruption emerge first. And that's where we focus. We think about TCO and how to really drive it, and we think about ways to drive TCO that aren't already controlled or constrained by the standards. We instead seek to see the standards as some sort of enabling platform that we can build on top of or adjacent to in a way that's worthwhile. We need to remain compatible so we can be part of the ecosystem, but that doesn't mean there isn't room for differentiation. And so I think the answer is maybe yes and no to this question. It's true. I think it's a little bit frustrating. I wish there was better opportunity for us to engage and for others to engage who are smaller than us. But at the same time, I don't think that that's going to block all innovation from emerging. I think there's going to be a platform upon which innovation emerges, off to the side in some cases, maybe solving problems that are even more vexing.
Okay, a glass half full answer there, Keith. I like it. Rima, will come to you next, and then to Jason.
Yes, thank you. So I wanted to look at it from two different points of view. One, yes, even though standards right now are driven by bigger companies because they have more resources and more experience in driving standards because they've been doing it for decades. But that sort of gives the new companies a known entity, right? They know what they're working with, so they can innovate in their own space without having to worry about shifting sands underneath, right? They know what they're coming to. But from the other point of view, speaking as a representative of an open source based company, it would be great if standards operated a little bit more the way open source does, a bit more on merit and allowing everybody to have a voice. We know how to do it. Red Hat has been doing it for years. Other companies have been doing it for years as well, where it's not even a company that needs to contribute. It can be one person, small entrance, somebody who is just a hobbyist, and it works. We know that it works. We have platforms running on open source, running some of the biggest banks and some of the biggest telcos in the world, and it's functioning. So there is a way to do it, and we would absolutely love if that happened in the standards world as well.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Jason, and then Gil.
Yeah, I mean, to propose a slightly different way of thinking about it, I don't think it's going to. In the standards efforts, you're typically talking about interfaces and data structures and format of information that you're basically pulling out. I think the competitiveness in the space, the better way to think about it is like why is it that TikTok is so much better at driving virality around a little video than say YouTube is? And it comes down to the actual process of collecting the data, doing machine learning, and then actually going and having the best algorithmic implementation around control and optimization of this entire environment. Because what's basically being asked of the vendors is to be cheaper from a unit economic perspective, while hopefully, according to their, just because a lot of people in the RAN space, not the best business, right? So you sit down and say, okay, we're supposed to go down from a unit economic perspective, but we would like these things to maintain or increase in their profitability. That's an optimization problem that's going to be driven by data from that. Each and every one of these guys are sitting there and would love to have as much data as possible from the performance and the characteristics of all the competitors in sort of like the space. Because the name of the game from the competitive standpoint is who's really going to have the best algorithmic implementations around the optimization and care of these networks. And it's going to be that sort of core technology inside of it that's going to differentiate who's going to win in the space, not any of the stuff that's basically talked about within a standards body. That's my opinion.
Okay, great. Excellent points, Jason. Thank you. Gil, and then back to Keith.
Sure. I think what Jason said, it's very true. I do want to point out a couple of things as one that is very involved in ORAN Alliance, especially Workgroup 6. It is open to everyone to contribute. Okay, and the standard versus open source are two different dynamics, and I think they're both in place and should work together. Like we'll say the standards is more about the interfaces, the data model, okay, more than how you implement it inside and whether you do an open source or you don't. And and again, like we'll say, the algorithm, it's a very critical piece of, let's say, innovation and how you can implement the same interface in a different way inside. As with regard to the big companies that contribute more, I do see also some small companies and mid-sized companies. And the key things with standard, it takes time. It takes time. It's a lot of it. It's based on consensus or some level of very high level of consensus. And you just need to, everything takes many cycles, getting all the opinions and getting to an agreement. And it's just harder for smaller companies, especially the company that are strapped on revenue and like a startup, to be able to justify. But it's not that it's not open. It's not that anyone, only big companies can come and do this in smaller will be blocked. It's not the case.
Sure. No, absolutely. And just to make it clear, I don't think the person asking the question was suggesting that it was a closed shop. Just that the statistics showed that maybe larger companies were having were contributing more, which it kind of makes sense in a way. Keith, we'll come to you to close this out. The red light in the corner of the virtual studio is flashing like crazy, so
Sure.
we'll close out with you, Keith.
Sure. Well, thanks. So I have a little different view on the relation to the standards bodies to innovation. And in particular, because what the standards bodies do is they create these interfaces, and that creates the box in which innovation can happen. And as you see more and more drive to break things up into smaller and smaller pieces, the freedom for somebody to think about the problem differently gets constrained. And so, I agree the standards are necessary, that the communities can be open. They probably could be more open. But I don't think it's the case that the standards bodies are entirely disjoint from the process of innovation. If we were to think up a better way to do something, except it turned out that it crossed the boundaries that were defined by a standards body, it would be incredibly challenging for us to bring that to market, even if it was demonstrably superior. And so I think it's important that as the standards bodies imagine what they're doing, they're trying to make sure that there's room for innovation to happen when that innovation necessarily requires change on both sides of their interface, right? That's how things like TikTok emerge, right? Their interface is a screen and there's videos. It's the whole engagement model. There's no internal interface that's shared between TikTok and YouTube. It's just what the end user experience is. It's that scope that allowed them to innovate in the way that's described, and it's real. I just hope that the standards bodies allow all the vendors to continue to do the same.
Okay, so think inside the box, but also think outside the box. I think that's the way to go. So, Guy, back over to you, I think, to close us out.
Indeed, a great question to end with as well. Some great comments there. And that is all the time we have. It's the end of our after show for today. Thank you so much to all of our guests who joined us for this live program, and to our audience for sending in many questions. And we'll be back tomorrow with another live after show program, and of course more coverage of Open RAN.
Yep, we have a roundtable discussion that looks at telecom silicon, because who doesn't like to talk about chips, right? And interviews with executives from Ericsson, and that one's on security, and the ONF on advances with SD-RAN. And of course, our third live Q&A session of the week. I cannot wait.
Me neither. And do remember to send in your questions for the after show as soon as you can. Don't leave it too late. So join us again tomorrow for the final day of the Open RAN Summit. Goodbye for now.
The after show was recorded in front of a live online audience.